to the cloud. All right, we're officially recording. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name's Ann Pfister. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology here at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, Florida, and Director of the Digital Humanities Institute, or DHI. The DHI promotes collaboration on interdisciplinary projects that combine the use of technology with materials and methodologies from the humanities, fine arts, and social sciences. The DHI is composed of faculty and students across our campus at UNF. It's an intercollegial institute bringing student and faculty interests and expertise together through a variety of venues, including programming like today's discussion. I set a few goals for my 2-year term as DHI director, and as an anthropologist, these include bringing in more social science projects and perspectives and broadening the focus of digital to include technology more generally. After all, in the field of anthropology, technology is nearly synonymous with human culture and ingenuity, and is studied as a crucial component of our evolution as a species. In other words, technology is something that makes us uniquely human. So today we'll hear from Dr. Mitra Ahmad and Dr. David Searing. And they're both, this was a mistake on our original publications, my fault, by the way. They're both from the anthropology program housed within the Department of Studies in Justice, Culture, and Social Change at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. They co-founded the Participatory Media Lab in 2012. Mitra Ahmad is a 2018 winner of the Horace T. Morse University of Minnesota Alumni Association Award for Outstanding Contributions to Undergraduate Education and is a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she's developed pedagogical and research approaches around participatory media, public ethnography, digital storytelling, and civic engagement. Ahmad teaches and writes about cultural constructions of the human body, especially in terms of how the body functions as a site for cultural translation. Ahmad has published articles about the American comic book Wonder Woman, about the intersections of early web-based communication forums with health-seeking behavior, and about the cultural constructions of pain. Her work on the body as a site for the cultural translation of American acupuncture has moved into an analysis of reflective practice and hands-on training among acupuncture students and medical students. David Searing is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Minnesota Duluth and Director of the Master in Professional Studies in Multidisciplinary Research and Creativity. His research, teaching, and community engagement includes cultures of place, the arts, plants in human cultures, regional food systems, and sustainability. His first book, Places in the World a Person Could Walk, Family Stories, Home, and Place in the Texas Hill Country, was a Minnesota Book Award finalist. Since 2005, he's done fieldwork in Ecuador with indigenous community members in Tuncarta, Saraguro, I hope I'm saying that correctly. This led to the book With the Saraguros, The Blended Life in a Transnational World. He creates videos with Saraguro collaborators and others. He co-created with Dr. Mitra Ahmad the Participatory Media Lab at UMD to teach research methods for community engagement and social change. So let's see. So today, in addition to discussing the concept and practice of participatory media, including digital storytelling, our guests will speak about 2 current projects. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Drs. Ahmad and Searing. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Anne. I'm going ahead and sharing our screen, and just for participants to know that we will share a PDF version of this document, so don't feel that you have to screenshot or take wild notes or anything like that. And we're going to try to take turns putting links in the chat as each of us speaks a little bit here. So, so hopefully you can have access sorry, multitasking. You can have access to the chat and be able to see things as they come through there as well. So I think I'll start with just a little bit of an introduction here to our lab. And we have a mission statement, and we have a YouTube channel. So those are some things that we can pop the YouTube channel into the chat for you, and you can see a tiny URL link there too that you could copy out if you want to. What's interesting is that since 2012, we've mostly been doing the lab and not a whole lot of web presence or intentional sort of gathering of attention to the lab. And it's really only in about the last 6 months, thanks in maybe no small measure to not having some of the same workflow as one had pre-COVID, that we were able to craft a mission statement. So, and what we did was sum up what we've been doing in large part in creating this. And this is a participatory model of the social sciences around digital media. So our orientation is towards community voices, and that was a key element of putting together this mission statement. And we engage that mission by working both in small business, local small business settings, as well as in community organizations with a variety of stakeholders around informing, discussing, debating in order to transform systems. And this may simply coalesce with those stakeholders' own missions, and as well as interpreting the present and the past to seed the future. So there are pretty key ways that the lab creates a space for reflective practice for ourselves and for our community and business partners and for our students. So in different contexts, we've had students engaging in this mission through classroom work, through outside research, grant funded or otherwise. So undergraduate students primarily, although we're going to look at some graduate student projects as well as we work through our presentation. So that's a little bit on our mission. And I think this is our official college website representing the lab. So there is, we have a little bit of a web presence that was created. And this is just a screenshot, so it's not the live web page, but I think maybe David's putting that in the chat. There is a video here that's interesting to watch. I think it was made in 2018 for a conference where we were representing the lab in 2 parts. One part sort of explanatory and theoretical, and the second part with lots of examples of stories and projects that came out of the lab. So that's a good video that kind of introduces things. You can see the screenshot there has the actual space, which is right outside this office. It's very small. So there is a literal lab and there's a figurative lab. And that video kind of explains.
I mentioned something about the video.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to mention, so about this video, this was prepared for the the Society for Cultural Anthropology has an annual conference. And a few years before, even before the pandemic, they decided it was time for conferences to go virtual.
Right.
And so this was a conference in 2018. They're doing their conference every other year in collaboration with the Society for Visual Anthropology. And it's meant to be virtual. So there's lots of great digital material that comes out of that, a lot of great examples of social science work that engages technologies. So just wanted to mention that as something people might want to look into. Yeah, so this is, I teach a class, I teach an undergraduate class, which is the project that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that we're working on this semester on participatory digital and visual research. This is the textbook that we use in that class. It's a great basic resource for social scientific approaches to using participatory visual and digital methods. And Aline Gubrium and Krista Harper define digital and visual methodologies as multimodal, using lots of different kinds of technologies, as guided by narrative in the data, as guided by the interests of the participants in projects, prioritizing their engagement, and literally putting the methods in the hands of the participants so that we can honor the contract that academia has with the rest of society to actually make our work meaningful and reaching into community spaces. So this is a really great book. There's also a case studies companion volume that lists, that has different authors writing about the work that they've done using participatory visual and digital methods. Great resource for teaching undergraduates and graduate students, and just really solid for if you're interested in sort of getting more of a grounding in how anthropologists and other social scientists are actually using these kinds of methods. Yeah, so you know, we started doing this. The Participatory Media Lab was founded in 2012, so we've been at this for about 10 years now. We got a little bit of funding from our chancellor. We had a new chancellor come in and offered some funding for strategic initiatives. And so we applied for and got $10,000 to start out with, and we basically used that to buy a bunch of equipment so that we could start playing with these kinds of technologies. So we bought cameras, we bought Zoom audio recorders, and then we also bought a subscription to WeVideo, which is an online video editing platform that we use with our students. We have a multi-user license. So, you know, if you're at an institution that wants to do these kinds of things, those are things that are really useful tools. And we started doing this partially because both of us got interested in digital storytelling as a model. Mitra first went and did a workshop at the Center for Digital Storytelling in Berkeley, which is now called the Story Center, which is a community-based space where they teach people, anybody who wants to come and do workshops, how to use digital storytelling around anything that they're interested in. So that became our first sort of field of exploration for doing this kind of work. But we realized pretty quickly that there were other things that we wanted to do. So Anne mentioned that I do field work in Ecuador, and I took some of my camera equipment with me down there, and the community there was like, wow, you have really cool cameras, and we want you to film us dancing, doing some of our traditional dances. And so they basically turned me into a participatory research media maker, researcher, by doing participatory video production. And then also we've been reading and sort of learning the sort of ground of this terrain for the last 10 years. Charles Menzies, who's an indigenous anthropologist that teaches at the University of British Columbia, has a really great piece in that companion volume that I talked about, where he talks about different models of working with the community and how often a community might be engaged, and how often they might say to an ethnographer or an academic, we think this is a really great project, you go do it, we support it, but we're not going to take the time to participate in creating it and doing all of that. So we came up with this sort of Venn diagram of 3 different possible models of doing participatory research, and we do different aspects of this with our students. Go ahead.
Yeah. I would add something just about how we represented these 3 arenas on this diagram, and just the sense that we both have learned that hybrid and interstitial forms are really great at reversing maybe the assumption that a form should dictate the outcome, but rather to think instead about what form would best serve the creative outcome that you're going for. And at the same time, that if these forms or these sort of genres are new to you or to students, to actually dig in and fully learn one and really engage with it within its own boundaries prior to looking for those interstitial and hybrid kinds of crossovers of usage. And I found that especially beneficial with regard to digital storytelling, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we move forward further. And yeah, we put this in to make ourselves stop. So pausing for questions and just seeing if you want to use the chat or if you want to just unmute, if there's any questions or comments so far, and then we're going to go into more specific examples and details from here. Just, are you on the chat?
Yeah.
And we can just go ahead. Maybe people are coming through.
I'll just say quickly that I really appreciate the recommendation for that book and the reference to Charles Menzies, and I'm taking notes even though you told me not to.
It's all there. That's cool. Thanks, Anne. And actually, we added another layer of examples at the last minute because this is something I've been immersed in this semester, really more than ever. I've been teaching with graphic ethnographies for years, particularly medical ethnographies that I use in my medical anthropology class. where we use a lot of graphic narrative, illness narrative specifically, almost always written by the experiencer of the illness. And there's a whole genre there, if you don't know about it, of medical graphic novels or graphic art in the medical realm. But these are some examples. I'm currently with one of my graduate students writing a review of Light and Dark Times, which came out, I think, about a year ago. At the same time, we're involved, kind of inspired from, these are all anthropological works. All of the ones that you see before you come from anthropology. And we're using the resources of the lab to start to work on our own graphic narrative as well around, my research is on the intersections of the body and culture, specifically in terms of somatic experience and somatic experiences that engage or resolve trauma. And so we started working, and so there's a call and response that's developing right now in our project. And it's a bit like, it's a very emergent new project, but we have this character called the walrus. And there's a sort, this first image was created by me, and then the second one was created by my collaborator. So there's a sort of a call and response happening in terms of one of the pages that we've been creating for this project. So I wanted to just pop that in. That is not like something we've been doing since 2012. This is very new, using iPads, using art production possibilities that are available to everybody. Everybody can kind of find things that art or create things that art, as Lachlan Jane specifies in her work.
Links to all four of those.
Thank you. So links are available. But this is probably the project that I've spent the most time on in terms of since 2012. And the way we conceive of digital storytelling is highly influenced by the Story Center, which, as David said, is not an academic organization at all. In fact, it's a grassroots organization that supports active action, community stakeholders, and those kinds of connections, which is what we were trying to grow in our own engagement with creating this lab. So there's a nice definition there. Digital story is a multimedia presentation with some combination of digitized still images, video clips, voiceover, narration, and music. And those are the elements of a digital story. We get this, as I said, from the Story Center, which was founded by Joe Lambert. And this is his book, Digital Storytelling, Capturing Lives, Creating Community, which Routledge has, I think, in a 5th edition at this point. So I won't go over all of those 7 elements, but you can certainly think in terms of that definition, where the images, the audio, any other audio, so the audio of the voice, the voiceover, the narration, and then other audio sounds that might be included, and music. Those are all elements of the story itself. Assembling the story with regard to pacing and economy is a key element. So these stories tend to be only 2 or 3 minutes long, sometimes 4 or 5 minutes. So within that range, they begin with writing. So one of the key elements that make this form of digital storytelling a reflective practice is that they begin with writing. So carving out space to write is a hugely significant element of that. We wanted to include the Story Center here, which has its own, obviously its own website, and David gave you the link. So an example, this is a fairly recent example from one of our graduate students in MPS 8001. We're also both involved in a graduate program that is a Master of Professional Studies. That's a multidisciplinary program. And this came from the opening class for that program. So we are going to take 3 minutes or so and share this digital story called The Dignity of Risk by Libby Spahar.
I love riding my bike by myself. My only companion, this shadow, who I love to chase. A race I'll never win. My shadow looks strong, unbroken. A rare genetic disorder, over 3 dozen fractures, greater in number than years in my life. a sense of wholeness, safety, as elusive as my shadow. And so my rides clearly come with risk, especially when I'm on my own and 10, 20, 30 miles out from my starting point. Spotty phone reception, the trail difficult to access by car or ambulance. A chipmunk darting out in front of me. A pothole seen too late. A stick stuck in my spokes. Any of these details and countless others could lead to disaster for me. Over my handlebars, a crushed clavicle, a snapped wrist. Multiply all of this times the speed I am going, always wanting more. The mental equation doesn't add up. And still, I ride. The dignity of risk. The idea that all people deserve the right to take calculated, meaningful risks, regardless of disability status. To impede this right is to suffocate personal growth, self-esteem, and quality of life.
So that is one of my favorite examples coming from recent digital storytelling work, some elements that pertain to what we were just talking about with regard to the different elements. For one thing, the ease of access of video, that she is able to use video from her phone and to get video from her phone as she starts to think about what kind of footage she wants for the video clips, and then still images that she wants to use that she can just use her phone to do. So no special equipment really. I really encouraged them to use music that didn't violate copyright. And she was able to take a sort of a classical piece and use it beautifully for punctuation, as well as for silence at various moments. So she's really using a robust version of that element. And then she's incorporating her own art as well. So there aren't copyright issues around some of the visual representations either. So those are some of the pieces that I would pull out, aside from the profound meaning and the message that she's creating there for herself as a stakeholder and for disability rights activists in general. So, and we won't play this one for the sake of time, but this is an example of a colleague story that was created in a workshop we offered on campus. That should not be a question mark, called About Hockey, that then became what was the association? The Minnesota
Youth Hockey Association used it to promote their work.
Exactly. So this was a story about his daughter. Our colleague Dana Lindemann in French Studies created this about first moving to the region here in northern Minnesota, and his daughter instantly being pulled into the world of hockey as a young child, and what the impact of that was on her well-being and on her thriving, especially making this transition, moving to a new city. So
I gotta step in. So
Yeah.
So I showed this to my students, and they wanted to know the update because this digital story was made several years ago, and his daughter was just the youth hockey player of the year. She's like, it's like 8 years older, so, or player of the week last week. So
I assume she's like a teenager
Yeah.
now. Yeah. Yeah. So that's another example of how the form can support various different ends. We're very oriented, at least for me, especially as a researcher of somatic experience, on what the elements of reflective practice are through this form. Most creative works, Joe Lambert, who's the sort of founder of the Story Center, he talks about most creative work has a component of effort. You have to learn new stuff. It's not easy to work with technology and to work with even with genres and practices that aren't that familiar. And he sort of brings forward that any kind of creative work has that component of effort to it, and that's useful for deeper reflection. That sometimes, as we say in anthropology, rendering the familiar strange can be a powerful way to enhance our capacity to reflect deeply. So digital storytelling is inherently, in that sense, a form of reflective practice. It's been used, we used it very recently, just a few weeks ago, in the anti-racism summit that occurs every year at UMD. We invited participants to build a 1 to 3 minute video story around a single image. We wanted to streamline the digital storytelling work and the sort of heavy lifting aspects of it to increase the reflection, the capacity for reflection. So there's a little bit of background on this slide on that summit and what we were doing. But what I wanted to share with you are some of the prompts we used. As I mentioned earlier, this is a form that is primarily used for writing. And that begins with writing as the key component of reflective practice. So as I mentioned before, these slides will be available to share so you can see what some of the prompts are that we used in that context. So orienting in a way towards anti-racism work with the assumption that the participants were aware and already participating in anti-racism work. So we were not building any kind of pedagogy around explaining what microaggressions were, for instance, or what privilege is, but rather assuming some knowledge of that and creating prompts that allowed stakeholders and participants to think about their own roles. So this second one is thinking about microaggression, both from the standpoint of feeling like you have been the target of a microaggression, where you experienced what Resmaa Menakem calls a lack of regard from another person. This is an interesting definition of microaggression from his book, My Grandmother's Hands. And Menakem is not an anthropologist. He's a somatic experiencing activist and a trainer of police around these types of issues of the intersections of the soma with anti-racism work. The second one is also from his work, where we're thinking about committing a microaggression, whether we do it intentionally or unintentionally, the idea of committing a microaggression when you may have expressed a lack of regard for another human being. So those are two ways of thinking about a topic or a way of reflecting to start to move in the direction of creating a digital story. And then we had similar ones around white privilege, and these also come, I believe these also come from My Grandmother's Hands, although we were very influenced by Layla Saad's work as well. Layla Saad wrote Me and White Supremacy and has a lot of great questions that can spark this type of reflection on anti-racism work. And then we, I think, are also, as many of us are nowadays, influenced by Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And Kendi argues that microaggression should be replaced by the phrase racial abuse, which I feel may not spark reflective practice quite the way our orientations are on this slide, but is an excellent corrective to thinking about the role of microaggressions in society. So from there, once people have written a little bit and we've carved out time for writing, then the next component that I think is as essential as writing is sharing in a story circle or in a paired environment with others. And we encourage the listeners to really listen for the sort of dramatic moment or question and to mirror it back to the storyteller so that they can find that core moment of their story. And then for the storyteller, they get to run their feedback session. They get to say, that's enough. I don't want any more. They can say, I still feel like I want feedback on this element or whatever. So they run their own feedback session. It can be very difficult if it's a circle to know how much time to set aside, because it can be quite variable, how much time it takes for each person to feel complete with regard to their feedback. So we'll do another pause here for questions. Are there any coming through the chat?
Encourage people to use chat.
You can use the chat, or you can unmute if you have anything at this point. Otherwise, we'll continue.
Have you done this in multi-language settings? Have you done digital storytelling workshops in multi-language settings? She's asking.
No, but I think it could be. I think that definitely could be done. Do you mean in multilingual, as in there are multiple languages in the room? I think David probably could address that question better than I could.
Yeah.
Because you work in Spanish.
Yeah. So I'll step in here and say that while we haven't used this in multilingual settings directly, I have done digital storytelling work and participatory media work with my students when we studied abroad in Ecuador. They created digital stories midway through the program, and those were all done in English. But at the end of the program, they were also required to create a participatory video with the community members that we were with. And those had to be set up so that they were intelligible to either English or to both English and Spanish speaking people. So some of them added subtitles, some of them did them in Spanish. Some of them had sort of language play back and forth. So, but we have not actually tried this in a multilingual context necessarily in terms of the digital storytelling model. I think that the Story Center likely has done that. I'm not sure, but you could check their website for that. Are there other questions on what Mitra presented? All right, I'll go ahead and talk about the next one, and we can certainly have a conversation as we go forward. So building on the idea of doing anti-racism work with this kind of approach, I have been working with my students, and several of my students are on the call here, so I'm going to invite them in a moment if they'd like to say anything about this collaboration to please feel free to unmute and speak. We've been working in a class that I teach. Every year I teach a methods class that's called Digital and Participatory Research Methods. And that was a revised version of our methods course. We used to have a conventional anthropological methods course. Gotta keep that muted. We used to have a standard sort of ethnographic methods course, and a few years ago, as a result of some of the conversations that came out of creating the PML, we decided to revamp that. And so the methods class that we teach now, we have several methods classes, one in archaeology, and then this other course is focused on digital and participatory methods. So we do basic ethnographic learning about ethnographic methods, but the focus is, the product focuses are really around using participatory media to create projects. So my students are currently doing their own digital stories like what we've just seen described, but for the first part of this semester, we spent collaborating with a committee of the local foundation, Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation. They started something they call the Unity Committee last year, and they're creating a fund to support African heritage and African American led projects in the community. And so my students have been working with them. We're going to look at one example created out of that collaboration. I want to talk a little bit about what that is. And I want to give you a sense of the time that it takes and the process that it takes to make community engaged research happen. I know that that's something that your Humanities Institute is interested in. And so I just want to give you a sense that it takes time, right, to develop this. I met back in August with Karen Sunderman, who has been hired as the community impact specialist for the foundation. I've known Karen for a long time. In different contexts, she was a reporter. My band has played on her local TV show. So there's a relationship that was there already. But even it took back in August, I sat down with her before the fall semester started, and just outlined what the PML is and how it might, be of value for community engagement. And so Karen took that and kind of cooked on that. And in December, the end of that fall semester, she reached out to me and said that this committee, the Unity Committee, had been meeting and they had been talking about, she said, do you know anything about photo voice? And I said, this is perfect, because the very first method that's in that book that I showed you, the methods book that I showed you earlier, is photo voice, right? So her committee, her group of people had heard about the idea of photo voice, and they were exploring how could we do something like that in our work. So she reached out to me and said, why don't you come to one of the committee meetings and join us to see if there's something that you could do with your students and create something together. So I attended that committee early in January. Our semester starts on the 18th or so of January, so it was just a week or two before the semester started. But I attended that committee meeting. We got very excited about the possibility here for synergy for the students learning at the same time that we would be serving our community. Janet Kennedy stepped forward as somebody who was willing to be a lead collaborator on that. Ms. Kennedy is a city councilor in Duluth. She was the first African-American elected to the Duluth City Council. She's been very active in the community in all kinds of ways. She had to run 3 times before she was finally elected, which you'll hear a little bit about in the video I'm going to show you in a minute. And Salam Witherspoon is the chair of that committee and member of a family that's been really significant leader in the African-American community in this city for decades. And they both stepped forward and said, okay, we'll come and collaborate with your students. So the class started meeting in mid-January. Janet and Salam came to class via Zoom. This is one of the wonders of this particular medium that we're all resentful we have to use, but at least we can talk to each other. And so they came. It made it easy for them to join us in the middle of the workday to come to class. And we brainstormed together with the students and came up with 2 immediate frames for the project. So the first one was, Ain't I a Woman Too? And I'm going to show you the video that has resulted from that collaboration. And then the second one is the idea of Ubuntu as an idea, a concept. That's a South African philosophical idea that basically translates as I am because we are. So it's about togetherness. And those were 2 projects that the Unity Fund members, Unity Committee members said, we want to do this. We want to work on these. So starting in late January into mid-February, the students were barely sort of getting into the classroom with us, right? But we threw ourselves together and we threw ourselves at this project. Students developed drafts. You're going to see the culmination of all of that process here in a minute. It was based on a project that Janet had started herself. And I'll just let this video speak for itself. Students made drafts of the video. Salam and Janet joined the class and gave us feedback, and then the students went back and did revisions on them. Out of all of that, each student created something, and Janet highlighted the pieces that she liked and wanted to really pull into this project, and we created a video together. So I gotta exit here for a minute, this slideshow. I want to share with you, this is a little bit longer video. It is 7 minutes long. Yeah, so, and this is the place where I'd like to ask you to pause the recording if you would. And I'm only asking you to do that because this is still in process of getting, so. Let's see here.
Those were powerful videos. Thank you for sharing them.
Yeah, thanks for watching. And I'm gonna say I'll invite any of the students who would like to speak. I know that Catherine and Eliza are here, and some others. Alexandra looks like maybe joined. Any of you that would like to speak about what this process has been like. For the students, this is actually probably the first time they've maybe seen this compiled version of this, because they each individually created versions, and then Janet asked for certain parts from different ones to be combined. And so this is a culmination of several weeks of conversations we had and of the work the students did. So the students, some of you will recognize pieces that you brought in. The students did a really great job of finding B-roll footage that could complement some of what was going on. The ways that they made some of the edits really caught the attention for Janet. And then the voiceover, this is a really great little story, and Eliza, maybe you want to speak up about how that came about, but we actually have the voiceover of Sojourner Truth is being spoken by somebody who's not in the class, who was a friend of Eliza's, who she got to do it. So I want to just invite any of you students that are on here, if you want to unmute your camera and your mic and speak up, please do, about what this experience has been like for you. Being shy.
Hi, I just had to move to a quieter spot. I'm in the hallway.
Thanks,
Sheena.
Well, I will hold it for a minute, and I'm going to invite you again in a few minutes to speak up. I'll talk through a little bit more about what we've been doing, so that you can have the full picture of this before we just have a general conversation. So we finished up that piece of project, and we've shifted in February. We shifted to the second piece, where we're filming people from the community who want to talk about what it's like to live in this community as a member of the African heritage or African American category, but also sort of talking about what Ubuntu might mean to them and what this fund might mean to them. So we have had 2 community filming sessions. One was at the AIM Church. You see an image here on the lower right. That's Eliza behind the camera, and Catherine's back behind the other camera, and some other folks watching. We filmed there one night, and then we also filmed in a local soul food restaurant, which is where the image from the lower left comes from. We have about 10 folks have given statements about what this fund might mean for the community and about what their experiences have been. And so the students have worked on an initial draft for an Ubuntu story, a story about this that will also be to sort of support the Unity Fund's efforts. And we will be finishing up those films probably in the next month. So for when we came back from spring break a few weeks ago, I decided to have the students have an opportunity to actually have creative control over the entirety of a story. So they're doing their own digital stories now. And then for April, we'll finish up by going back to the Ubuntu stories, and maybe 1 or 2 other videos that we're going to do with the committee, so that we can help tell their story in the ways that they want to be told. So that's, I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for some conversation. I didn't want to fill up everything. And so I just would like to invite just students to speak up, or if other people want to ask questions now, I'm going to stop my screen share here. If other people want to have a conversation here, this was billed as a roundtable, and I always think a roundtable means that we all get a chance to talk. So any of the students willing to share a little bit about what this has been like for them?
Yeah, I would just say overall, it's been a wonderful opportunity to get out into the community, and it's been my first class that has done that. Well, I've done it a few different times, but like actively just be working with community members in a really creative way too. And I appreciated having Janet and Salam there too, because I was familiar with them beforehand, but it was nice to create something with them overall.
Thanks, Eliza. Hey, Eliza, can you tell us a little bit about why your decision to seek out a friend to do that performance of Sojourner's speech and how that unfolded?
Sure, for sure. Yeah, so I actually was the one who spoke that piece when we first thought of it, of having a voice recording. And I struggled with it personally, because I don't know if any of you are familiar with what happens in Hollywood too, when you have colorist practices too, where you have biracial women taking the roles of people who are monoracial, or just have 2 Black parents too. So I didn't want to add to that harmful trend of doing that, even if it is in a small way, even if we did have time constraints for class. So I reached out to a friend of mine who's in the theater department. Her name is Sandy Flan. She's wonderful. And she fits the background more than I do. And we worked on it one day on Thursday, and I gave her the piece too, and we recorded it together, and she's just been wonderful. So I have to say thank you to her for, wanting to do that, and because she didn't have to, and she did me really great kindness too. So, and yeah, I ended up taking out to lunch too. So, but yeah, that was a piece that I thought was important for my own self, and just for ending harmful trans sakes, because I know there's actresses like Thandie Newton who have contributed to it, and Zendaya, and I didn't want to add to that as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Eliza. I also want to just say, from a professor standpoint, it's so exciting that a project that's happening in our class reached out and pulled someone in from outside of the class. So other students, Catherine or Alexandra? Oh, I guess Alexandra disappeared here. Would you like to, is she still there? Yeah. Would you like to say anything about the project and what it's been like?
As someone who, like, this is kind of what I want to do further along in my career, is this creating and sharing of stories. It's been really great to work with, and to work with Janet and Salam about these stories that up until fairly recently just weren't getting told. They were there, they were always there, and always these amazing stories, but for so long, even in academia, that the focus was on the white perspective, and even stories around race were about kind of a white savior complex. So being able to as a white person just sit back and listen and learn, it's very powerful. And then to be able to create something that isn't, it's going to be up on the website that's free to access, to anyone with internet. It's not going to be, piled away behind like a journal with a paywall or anything like that. And for me, that's really important to have, to increase the access to different stories and academic work that a lot of people don't have privilege to pay the journal fees, or to be connected to a university that pays the journal fees. So that's something that's very important to me.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Alexandra, you want to say anything about what it's been like for you working on this project?
I really enjoyed working on all these projects. It was very out of my comfort zone when we got started. I did not know anything about computers, anything about editing, but it was right off the bat. Like, once you got over the intimidation factor, you were just listening to the narrative of someone that was not you. And that's kind of an opportunity that we don't really give ourselves, and life doesn't really give us that often. Like, it kind of has to happen. And working on these projects, like, I was part of the story, but it wasn't my story. And that was a really cool experience that I really appreciate having.
Thanks, Alexandra. I'll give you all a heads up that you might suddenly hear a bunch of dings of people entering, because I did invite my students to join us. And so 3 of them were able to come a little early, but the class that we actually are doing this in meets starting in 3 minutes. So a bunch of people may flood in here at the last minute, but that's what we have for sort of presentation. I would love to have some conversation about what the Digital Humanities Institute is doing, and sort of how we might collaborate, or the kinds of things that you're imagining. So, so thanks for listening to us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, and to the students who have shared with us. We're really appreciative of that. And I actually was thinking about a couple of questions that maybe we can open up as more students come in. But in the meantime, I'll share with you all that I gave a brief introduction to our Digital Humanities Institute. I'm an anthropologist like your professors here today, and a few of us are, and I'm the director right now, but it's a very interdisciplinary institution. So these 2-year roles as director, the directorship allows us to kind of cross-pollinate with other disciplines and kind of bring in interdisciplinary expertise and interest, really. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to share what anthropologists are doing in this realm with colleagues from other departments who are more traditional sort of humanists. But one of the things that a few colleagues, many of them that couldn't be here today, and I have put together, Rosa is here, she's from my anthropology department. But we've put together a proposal for a DHI Media Lab. And that's something that I think we envision being sort of similar, you know, the opportunity for us to be able to use these kinds of methods, to have a hands-on ethnographic component. And some of the things that there's Rosa. Thanks, Rosa. I know sometimes when we're on blackout on camera, we don't want to press the camera button, but thank you. So we had envisioned, you know, a place where we could create materials like this, analyze materials like this, right? And just, you know, have a space where we could use it from an ethnographic standpoint. Other colleagues in the language, literatures, and cultures department here at our university, they're already doing things like this. There's a project called Voces y Caras that Constanza Lopez, who's one of our DHI collaborators, she is already kind of engaged in this kind of storytelling with Latinx community members here in Jacksonville, and the idea of migration and other kinds of things. But, you know, as we're in an age of podcasts and digital storytelling, I mean, more and more this is of interest. It's sort of like the native habitat of many of our students. And so I think there are opportunities here that I will only speak for myself, but that I think would be hard for me to even envision sometimes. And so that's one thing that I really kind of wanted to bring. One of the questions I wanted to pose to you all, but to also your students is, you know, when I'm listening to podcasts, some that come to mind are the Moth Story Hour, for example, right? Or Ear Hustle, which is another podcast that I love and I use with my students. You know, in many ways, it's not ethnography, but there's an ethnographic component there, right? So I'm using my air quotes to say it's not ethnography per se. There's not the application of anthropological theory and these other kinds of things. But what is it about, for example, when I think about those videos that you've shown, you know, how are you conveying that the difference between the ethnographic enterprise and storytelling, right? Or what is the value there? I guess I'm kind of thinking through my question as I'm asking it, and sorry for bumbling around. I'm not trying to be cryptic, but what's the value in storytelling from an anthropological perspective, and two, how do you kind of bridge the gap between one of the things that I had even in graduate school, a question in my own mind was, well, how is what we're doing different than like travel blogging or travel writing or et cetera? And of course now I know, and I have an example of this, but I think it's a productive conversation for faculty and students to have, that we're not just making observations, right? And what's the value in that community perspective of an untrained anthropologist and those perspectives? If you can do a little bit of archaeology for me and dig out a question here.
Well, there were like 32 questions in what you just laid out for us. So I don't know. I mean, let's see if we can. The first piece from my perspective is, how is this not all those other things? How is this anthropology, right? And to me, I emphasize that anthropology is a contextual discipline it's about developing a cultural context to understand any particular phenomenon. And so that to me is the bottom line, is that it's grounded in a deep engagement of listening and finding the context, right? So it was interesting. One of the filming sessions we had for the Ubuntu video, Stephen Witherspoon said, you know, he made some comment about, oh, you're going to film me so you can misquote me, because he's been covered by journalists before and felt like he was not well represented. And I said, actually, the difference to me is that we're making this story with you, and you're going to get to have, you know, oversight. You're going to get to have input, and it's about getting the context, the whole context. So that's my sort of quick answer to that. I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when I teach through this lens of participatory media production, the sort of ethnography, either explicitly or implicitly or tacitly, that I'm trying to bring forward, I like to call it, even though I find it very capitalist to say so, but I operationalize the culture concept. So in other words, I'm attuning the participants, whether they're stakeholders or students, whether they're producing stories or giving feedback on stories, I'm orienting them towards culture in terms of what people think, make, and do. And so to me, those are the ethnographic cores of the story, right? What is being made or used? What are the artifacts before us? What are the social practices? What are people doing? What are they doing with their hands? What are they doing with their bodies? What are they doing that's visible? What are they doing that isn't visible? And then the meanings. What are people thinking about those artifacts? So operationalizing culture is a way of making this peculiarly anthropological, and peculiar in the sense that we want, I said this before, but we want to render the familiar strange, right? We want to make sure, yeah, we want to see if we can bring forward. Yeah, there's somebody that's got their audio on.
Amelia, could you mute your audio, please?
There we
Thanks.
go.
Got her. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Just that idea of rendering the familiar strange as a way, you know, to know that you kind of hit the sweet spot, right? When you have that little bit of discomfort, a little bit of, you know, being in a little bit of unfamiliar space, that to me is the ethnographic sweet spot. So that's my response.
Yeah. So Anne, I'd like you to kind of dig back through your question or your comments there and see. We've got a lot of the students on here now. What would you like to ask them about this process?
Well, I guess let's see. Fair question, but not an easy one. I guess what I'm really interested in from the students' perspective is, you know, from the perspective of students, what is it about narrative, in, like I mentioned some podcasts, but how is what you're doing in the classroom similar to and different from other kinds of media that you consume? And what makes it anthropological?
I love that.
That's a great question. I hope some of my students can answer that. Please feel free to unmute and speak up.
And this isn't a test. You see that
right.
Oftentimes what we're doing here is, you know, thinking through what we're really interested in. And so, you know, all of us say something and think, well, that made no sense. Let me kind of rethink through this. That's part of really the process.
Well, okay, so great. I see Amelia and Eliza are there and maybe want to speak. I'll just mention, we started doing some of this work in our classes because the students were asking for it, right? Because the students were saying, you know, we don't want to just, as Catherine said earlier, we don't want to just be writing papers that only you are going to read, right? How can we make things and be doing interesting things that can be, you know, have more legs to them? So so that's why we started. So Amelia and Eliza, do you guys want to say something?
I was just going to say that I think even the simple act of working with community members and doing interview process. That's not something we normally get in a in-class setting, but makes me feel like, oh, this is what anthropology is. If I'm going to actually be doing anthropology, it's going to involve more direct communication with the communities we're working with, and not just, again, not just book learning. And so even just a simple an excuse or a reason to talk with community members and collaboratively create something and feel like you're doing ethnographic work and not just reading about it.
Yeah, I'm still thinking through the question myself.
Okay.
Part of what I'll probably answer the first part of your question was, how is it different than other media that I consume or just like interact with? I would say the whole part is that it's participatory. I do a lot of podcasts, or I listen to a lot of podcasts. I have my own small podcast. That's not to talk about that, but it's participatory, and you get to see the whole process, how it's made as a whole too. And there's that criticism of like fly on the wall anthropology, where you're just kind of, the anthropologists themselves are just detached from it, and we're all up in it with the community too. So if you see in those videos too, I was thinking the other day, you can hear me laughing, or you can hear me kind of like my voice going like, and I don't know, it kind of adds a different presence there too. So that's how it's anthropological. I think you're including the anthropologist in it too. So it's a lot more, I don't know. It's a lot less, well, it's still scientific, but it doesn't feel so like cold, hard science. And it feels warm, and it feels like humanly too. So like you're not devoid.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's like, this is why I'm interested in anthropology. I'm interested in anthropology because I like people. I find people wonderful, and I want to interact with them. And yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hopefully
that's fantastic.
And I wouldn't sell the skills that you're learning to do this short either, because it's a really different skill set. And I'm reminded of what you presented on earlier, Micha, about, who is your audience? That's an important question. And that's very different for one paper that, I think sometimes students assume we're not reading very carefully, right? But you can get to know your audience if it's one person. It's a different thing if you're sending it out into the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a
completely different skill set.
And that's one of the 7 elements in the digital storytelling is eventually, once you do the writing and you kind of land on your story, is thinking about who do you want to have hear this story. So then where are you positioning that story in participatory media? Where are you positioning that piece of media out in the world where it's going to reach exactly and connect exactly to that audience, to the people that you want to reach with that story or with that piece of participatory media. So, and that's the public ethnography part, is how do we think about audiences? How do we think about who we're reaching with regard to constructing ethnography in this manner?
Yeah, I'll mention, you talked about the warmness that it brings, right? Amelia and Eliza, you talked about that, right? And my approach to anthropology is grounded in humanistic approaches to anthropology. I was the editor of Anthropology and Humanism for 5 years. I've written about that. And so narrative approaches have been something that, anthropology goes through up and down through cycles where we think of ourselves more as scientists or more as humanists, more as scientists. I think that's an artificial, a binary, but I'm in a part of anthropology that really values human experience and human narrative. And so I try to share that with my students, and I try to do that in my own work. The title of my book, Working with the Saraguro People, is With the Saraguros. And I emphasize that in teaching the students. With the students, we talk about withness, right? Anthropologists are with the communities that we work with. We're not studying on them or above them, but we are with them in the conversation. So I see Catherine, you turned on your thing, and Rosa, you did as well. So please feel free to speak up, either one, anybody.
If I may just jump in quickly too, the collaborative piece on analysis too is something that I use in my work quite a bit also, is that participatory analysis, so that the cultural theorizing doesn't just come from the outsider's perspective also. And that to me is one of the really important parts of these kinds of participatory methods.
Okay, so I have two questions. I'm pretty new to this digital storytelling, and so I apologize if the questions are pretty basic. One is, how do you collaborate with your IRB board? I mean, that's always kind of scary when we are thinking about producing things that might circulate outside of the boundaries of our classrooms. So I was wondering if you could address that. And also, how do you organize the student to collaborate with each other, which is always sometimes, at least, sorry, problematic, right? In that you have some students who are extremely active, some less perhaps involved. How do you bring this project together? So is there like an individual moment in which students work simultaneously and then they come together? Just understanding a little bit more the process. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think these are at all basic or there's no such thing, first of all. And the learning curve has been steep all around for all of us. So thank you for sharing your questions. I appreciate it. With regard to IRB, we set that up early on in the process. And in that context, which may be a little different now, nearly a decade later, we have not revisited IRB for this, but what IRB liked and supported was the agency of students, right? And so that students are choosing how to self-represent, students are choosing the stories they want to tell, students and stakeholders themselves are the story creators, seemed to relinquish the hold of IRB on what we could or couldn't do in regard to producing media out of this lab. So that's the short answer to that question, is that the orientation towards the agency of the people seems to remove it and make it expedited, at least it did when we first started, as not having the red flag of potentially creating harmful situations for so-called research subjects. And the fact that we weren't actually constituting this as an orientation towards subjects of research, that was where we experienced the shift out of IRB's radar to some extent. And then the other question about how to create collaborative spaces for students, well, one of the things is, and as long as, especially when our students are sitting right here, just have to do a shout out to how community glue gets created in this program aside from us. Like it isn't something that, we have to force or, or even sometimes really even create necessarily powerful structures for. This program, the anthropology program, does tend to attract, and maybe we find this in other anthropology programs, attract students who are on our campus. I would say they're pretty radically different from some of the other students, and they tend to connect with each other as a result. And so, yeah, so community glue is there, and creating structures. Even the questions that I showed in my piece of the presentation, creating loose structures, loose questions or whatever, to sort of, I don't know, to foster moments of time where students can sit with each other and do reflective practice, whether they're sharing a quick piece of free writing, whether they're just thinking about a question and discussing it with 2 or 3 other people. Those kinds of structures go a long way towards eventually then facilitating a project. And they can happen in different classes. So I think, for instance, pedagogically, I'm probably more oriented to those kinds of reflective moments than necessarily David might be. But then they come into David's class and they've already had maybe a class with me where they've had a lot of space to breathe, and they often do somatic work because I also teach yoga, and they have this like really soft, smooth, reflective period. And then they come into editing, and I know I'm speaking for you guys, so you'll have to say whether this is true or not. This is what I'm making up in my head right now. They come into David's class and it's like, we're going out into the community today and we're going to get footage, and you're going to learn how to use a camera, and then you're going to go edit. And and not that there isn't reflective practice potentially in that setting as well. It kind of pendulates back and forth. But the fact that they've had those opportunities previous to coming to this class right? And that we are a coherent, the lab creates a kind of coherent program for undergraduates. I think that facilitates a kind of collaborative ethos. They see us collaborating too, which doesn't hurt. A sort of collaborative ethos that makes it possible to get really, I think, pretty amazing outcomes. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's been our experience.
I want to let the students respond to anything that they think they'd like to share about that.
Now that I've said what I think is happening.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Kat. I have to just say, I have to give a shout out to my friend Kat Bernhardt, who I went to college with years and years ago, and she just saw this posted on Facebook. I'm so delighted that you came. Would love to hear.
You're welcome. Well, let me then say aloud what I just wrote, but essentially. But I really enjoyed hearing, especially from you, Liza and Catherine. And I'm sorry. What is your name with Eliza?
Amelia.
Amelia, thank you so much for speaking up about what you're doing. And it's just really exciting, very creative, and that you are valuing the stories that other people have to tell is just really, really exciting. So I encourage you to continue doing this sort of work. I'm very excited, David and Mitra. It's great to virtually meet you and hear you. Very excited about the work that you're getting to do in helping work with young people and giving them these wonderful ideas and these great tools. I'm in Santa Fe right now, just so you know who I am. I'm at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. And this is it's a place for you guys to look into. There are, for scholars, you can end up in a program here and you can do research. So you might want to look for the website and see if that's something in the future you might want to be involved in. But anyway, I'm really excited about the future of storytelling in anthropology with technology. So kudos to you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too. Bye, Kat.
Thank you.
So if any other students want to speak about how the collaborative process goes, I have a few thoughts about what our specific collaborations have been like this semester, but if anybody else wants to speak.
Yeah, just, oh.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Go ahead.
Just about to say that being in this collaborative and in this community of like the anthropology students, like I was seeing that Eliza and Amelia are like together on campus and thinking, oh man, I should have been on campus. We've all been there together. Oh, we should have done that. Just being with a group of, I think kind of like Dr. Imad said, kind of a island of misfit toys, but like the best.
Not what I said.
An interpretation, a loose interpretation, but in like the best possible way. Just having a group of people who share like common values and want to work and focus like their academic journeys in the same kind of way and vein that I do. And we're, especially in this class, when we share like our different
like the different drafts.
Yes, I apologize. Words sometimes aren't my friends. Seeing like how people are doing it and just being so excited to see everyone's different piece, and to just when someone does something like really cool with like an editing way or lining it up with like a certain piece of music or a certain like shot, just being like, oh my gosh, like someone from my class did that, someone like my peer did that, like that's so cool. And just having that reaction is so important, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that, Catherine. I just want, Eliza and Amelia, I just want to say one thing before you guys speak, if I could, just to kind of elaborate on something Catherine said. So the process, Rosa, of collaboration in this particular class has been, I've had classes where I have students work in specific teams on a project, I think Eliza and Amelia both in a class where we worked on videos with farmers, right? And so those are more formally structured, and we create collaborative structures throughout the semester. For this particular class, we're doing a bunch of class meetings, sort of mixed Zoom, and some people are not in the room and some people are. I didn't feel like I wanted to try to take that on and the complexities of where we are now. So the students have actually been working on individual videos. They have access to the same common footage. And then they also have been really resourceful in finding interesting B-roll footage from some stock footage that we have access to. And then they upload that to our editing platform and for other people to use if they want. So that's how the collaboration is kind of unfolded. Each student has kind of looked for the things they wanted to do themselves, and then they share the resources. And that's been really effective. That led us to all make really much better second and third drafts of the videos that we're creating, because we're all sort of seeing, as Catherine suggested, oh, that's a really cool editing move, or that's a great piece of B-roll. We're going to work with that and pull that into ours. So, right. So Amelia and Eliza, you had something more you wanted to say.
I was just going to say real quick, I know sometimes in classes it can be a problem with no one wants to be the first to speak, especially when we're presenting our own work for other people to review. But in all of the draft meetings we've had so far, my experience has been, yeah, it's maybe a little shy at first, but then once one person speaks up and shows their product, everyone else gets excited to say, wow, I really like what you did here, or I would maybe tweak it just this little bit. And then once that conversation's flowing, other people in the group are going to be like, oh, now I want to show my piece, or my piece maybe isn't as good as your all's, but you seem to be kind, so I guess I can present it for you. And just once that communication gets started after that initial hump, I feel like that collaboration happens really easily and flows pretty freely.
I will say from my own standpoint too, this kind of going off of the process, but in various classes, especially in Mitra's too, I know we've done it in a little bit of David's class too, checking in with each other to start out with how we're doing. And like sometimes when I'm even in small conversations, we'll like start off with something else like besides our project, and then it'll be like, okay, now let's hop into it, because it's kind of, especially with your own stories too, like we did last week, it's kind of hard to put yourself out there like that, especially in like with intense things like identity and whatnot, and just storytelling. It's like checking in with each other first and foremost, and like seeing, acknowledging all of our human needs, especially on Zoom and whatnot, and in the classroom too. So that, I think that helps create a better situation, a better environment for collaborating with other people, especially in students too, when students are really going through the ringer in various ways. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Thanks, Eliza. Alexandra, do you have something you'd like to say? I just saw you turn on your camera. I just wondered if you had something you want to share.
Oh, it definitely made me think with working on all these projects, we're all so individual. Like you said, we start with the same foundation of this is a rough idea of where we're going, and try to fit in the guidelines, but make it your own individual project. It was really interesting, especially because you could see videos and you're like, I didn't even consider using that. Like the way they utilized different equipment was just so out of the box from what I was thinking. And it was really amazing to see that. And especially with how we began with participants. And now that we're doing individual projects, like it's their own creativity, it's their own story. And so they're really, you can't be harsh judges on it because there's nothing wrong with it. It's just how they want to share it with themselves. So even if it's not your story, you have to be kind, and it's just exciting to watch the process unfold.
Great, thanks, Alexandra. Well, we've been on here for quite some time. I don't know, Anne, if you want to do anything to wrap us up here. It's almost, we've almost been an hour and a half, and I don't want to overstay.
Yeah, no, I just really want to thank everyone again for being here. We'll post this, so please feel free to share, and I'll send you all a copy of the recording as well. But, on behalf of the Digital Humanities Institute here at the University of North Florida, we're thrilled to see what you all are doing. I think we'll take inspiration, you know, for our own projects. And thanks very much. Look forward, and we'll definitely look forward to opportunities to collaborate.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
We look forward to it as well.
Thanks. Thanks.
Might be nice to have students sharing things, or, you know, I mean, there's really, that's
Well,
the good news about Zoom is
that's exactly right. Good news about Zoom is
Yeah.
that we can have these kinds of conversations. I've done some collaborative online international learning where students have collaborated with people in other countries, and we have some people who are on this call, Linda Carroll and Helen Mongan-Rouse, who are experts in that.
Yeah.
This is an arena that is to me is opening up the utopian potential of the internet in a way that nothing else really does. So just thanks for having us, and we're going to keep these conversations going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks so much.
And I'm going to just mention one last thing to my students. I'm in my office now, and I'll also open our classroom Zoom. So if any of you need some support as you're working on your digital story editing, I'm around for the rest of the afternoon. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye-bye. It was a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fabulous. Thanks again. Let me stop recording.